have entitled this lecture as Born Resilient, Locating Vulnerability and Resilience in an Urban Informal Settlement. The objective of this lecture is to present a nuanced understanding of vulnerability and resilience in the periods of disaster. Because most of the time we understand resilience and vulnerability in more like a blanket statement that says that everyone is vulnerable in the same way. But in my 6 years of work in an informal settlement, I have come to understand that that is not the case. A common theme that we see in television and other forms of media post-disaster is that Filipinos are resilient. But I am very much a suspect of this perspective because what do we exactly mean when we say resilient? What is resilience? Is it about smiling at the face of a calamity, as in this picture, a man happily swimming in flood? Is it bouncing back after disaster? Is it about being creative in addressing the gaps that you have in terms of resources? How do we know that we are resilient? As I've said, in the 6 years that I've been working in an informal settlement, I have come to understand that vulnerability and resilience is a multi-layered phenomenon, a very complex web of all about context consisting of community dynamics, age roles, gender roles, and all of this are within the framework of structural context, such as policies on development and political economic conditions. When you put all of this together, they create what you call as the lived experience on vulnerability and resilience. To point that out, I'm going to use several parts of a case study in Baseco compound in Manila, and through the narratives of the people that I worked with in that community, we will see that vulnerability and resilience are two concepts that we don't experience in the same way. So let's go first to the first concept that I discussed, which is community dynamics. Every locality has a different environment, has a different history, and it is very important that when we study disaster resilience and vulnerability, that we can localize the measure for vulnerability and look into the socially approved responses to disaster. For example, in this picture, you will see two kids happily playing at the onslaught of Typhoon Ruby in 2014. And I was walking past them when they asked me if I could join them swimming in this very dangerous water area. This place is actually an estuarial community, which is a meeting of the Pasig River and the Manila Bay. And this water that you're seeing is actually thrice the height of these kids. You would also notice that they're swimming beside garbage, and they were doing this happily, without perception of danger. I asked them if they're not scared that they might drown. They said, no, it's okay, we know these waters. There's a difference in being vulnerable and being resilient, as we have seen, but there is also a difference when you're born into vulnerability. There are also what you call as age-specific roles. Age-specific roles are what we believe in intergenerational studies as the contexts that are defined by what cohort you are in a particular social economic history. Now, in Baseco compound, what we will notice is that there is some kind of fluidity in the understanding as to what is the role of a child and what is a role of an older adult. For example, in Filipino context, children are supposed to be going to school, while older adults should have retired and they should be working on things that would just be good for retirement. However, a problem that we have is that we are not in that scenario in this specific case. Because in Baseco compound, older adults are mostly working still. They're active caregivers and economic providers in their households. The same way as children. Children go to school, and then after that, they go to the fields. Like in this picture, you would see one of the boys that I was working with, and this was after his school. He had to go to the pile of rubbish to collect papers, metals, and all other things that he could salvage and then resell. This is actually a floating dump of water lily that he's stepping on. And I asked him, why don't you just go home and study? And he would say that, but studying is only for the morning, and afternoon is for work, evening is for work. So children have a different role in the society. And what's interesting is that during periods of disaster, children are very excited for what the flood will bring in. This picture is actually post one of the typhoons that we had, and he was very excited to go back to the field and try to salvage what he can for selling. And most of the time, it's the children and older adults who are competing to get these resources. Interestingly, disasters are not seen as a negative, fully negative experience for these people, primarily because all other resources come to them post-disaster, from plastic to other recyclable materials, even to fishes that escape the fish pens of the upper units. So disaster is not necessarily an evil form for them. In fact, it's more of a blessing somehow. Now, another concept that we have to explore is the concept of gender roles. In informal settlements, gender roles are quite blurred. It's different from other units of our society that have very strict forms of acknowledgement of what your role should be in society. In Baseco compound, people's roles are defined by their economic roles within the family. In a day-to-day basis, men are not found in Baseco compound or in other informal settlements that I have worked in. Men are usually doing contracted work outside of the area, and they are typically just sending money on a weekly, if they're lucky. If not, they send it on a monthly basis. So most of the time, you have the female parent and the child, and sometimes the grandparent existing in one household unit. The other context here is that in some cases, we have what we call as a missing second generation. This often happens in informal settlements wherein the middle generation, meaning the parent generation, is missing because they are performing economic duties outside of the community. Now, what's interesting to note is that when the middle generation is missing, the grandparent generation and the third generation, meaning the children, they are the ones who gather together and work together to maintain the household. In this photo, you would notice that the child and a parent are both working on a subsistence type of livelihood. This is peeling garlic. In this area, peeling garlic, one sack of garlic would actually be equated to 70 pesos. And that's their earning for the day, 70 pesos. Now, is that enough? Well, naturally, the answer is not. So this will not be enough to cover for water usage. This will not be enough to buy medicines. This will not be enough for anything else than food. So when disaster strikes, livelihood like this are put at a stop because the delivery of garlic sacks can't come into Baseco compound because of the non-existence of roads, and other forms of livelihood that depends on transporting products in and out of Baseco are totally and full stop. At this point, men who are not there will not be present still. It's the women's job to make sure that the family remains afloat at the face of disaster. The woman will have food networks that she will work with. The woman will be caring for the children as well. So all of this experience of vulnerability at the face of disaster and the resilience that are incorporated with it are all gendered in this community. I also would like to emphasize that when age and gender comes into contact, what happens is that we have more vulnerability experienced by older adult women than older adult men, or any of the parts of this generation. Why? Because the role of the older adult woman is to stay behind in the home while it's submerged in flood. This is to ensure that looting will not happen. This is to ensure that all the other recyclable materials can be gathered immediately after the floodwaters come down. You see, it's not just about socioeconomic status per se. Most of the time, gender, age, and how the community responds to disaster, all of these things will affect how a person's family will be able to cope with disaster. Now, for the structural context, I said a while ago that all of this context will be embedded in a greater plan, which is the structural context. The first question we should be asking is, why are the informal settlers always bound to be vulnerable to disaster? And the first answer I have is exclusive development. When the government and institutions pour their money on industries that are conveniently situated in the urban center, the ending of that is that all of your rural folks will be tempted to come into the city. And the problem is that when they get to the city, there is no cheap housing project. There will be not enough work that will be equivalent to their skills. And this catapults all of them into informal labor, a labor that will not even provide them with decent and sustainable income. And this promotes a different set of vulnerability. For example, these two maps that I'm presenting to you, these are the maps of Baseco compound. One in 2001, and the other one is that of 2017. You would notice that in 2001, there's not much housing in Baseco, while on the upper part, there is already field land and field spaces. What happened in between those times? 70,000 people living in a 52 hectare of a land. Even if flooding is a normal part of the day, it is cheap land. With all that the government is promising, they do have evacuation center that can only fit 3,000 people of the 70,000. And yet they still stay there. Why? Because we keep on providing our people with band-aid solution for disaster. We train them, but we do not equip them. We do not empower them to have a sustainable life to counter the impacts of climate change. This photo is one, I think I would like to close with this photo because this is one of the most poignant memories I have of my field, wherein children are happily playing right on top of garbage post a typhoon. And when you look into them, you see that they're just playing, just like any other kids. But the problem is that, are we really resilient? We never question that. Why? Because we always say that as long as the person is smiling, as long as you see them in photographs smiling, even if there's flood, even this photo, they're just playing right on top of garbage, you'll say, oh, they're resilient. But my question is, are they really resilient? Or have they been subjected to so much structural violence to the point that violence became the norm? You see, when violence becomes the norm, you're not resilient. It has just been normalized to you so that your aspirations are withheld. Your ideas of yourself are withheld. And ultimately, it becomes a cycle. Children born into poverty and violence will remain in that situation as long as the structural components of our society remains the same. Thank you.